Adelante.
¿Qué tal? Bienvenidos, bienvenidas a esta quinta sesión del Seminario Permanente de Estudios Canadienses, SPEC, que continúa en modalidad virtual. Primero, por el COVID-19 y ahora por encontrarnos fuera del país en una estancia sabática de investigación. No obstante, ya estamos preparando, estamos comenzando a organizar lo que sería la tercera sesión de este año, por ahí de octubre, esperemos, ya sería cuestión de platicarla, para que sea la primera en modalidad híbrida, es decir, presencial en nuestras instalaciones del CISAN en la UNAM, y también pues a través de la plataforma Zoom para que nuestros y nuestras colegas del interior del país y también canadienses puedan mantenerse presentes en cada sesión. También recuerden que estas sesiones, le decimos a nuestro público, se quedan, se transmiten por nuestro canal institucional en YouTube del CISAN y ahí se quedan para que puedan seguirlas cuando ustedes así lo decidan. Good morning in Mexico, good afternoon in Ontario and in the Canadian East Coast. Greetings from Halifax, Nova Scotia. Today, we have a special session for the sabbatical research stay that our colleague and friend, Dr. Camelia Tigau, is doing at the University of Toronto in Ontario, Canada. For this reason, she has invited a couple of well-known Canadian colleagues so they can show us some of their current research. I anticipate that the next session will also be a special session to be held in May with colleagues from St. Mary's University, which is where I am doing my sabbatical research here in Nova Scotia, and we will send you the respective information and invitation very, very soon. I remind you that following the dynamics of previous sessions, the presentations are given in alphabetical order by last name. También quiero agradecer muy especialmente a la doctora Marcela López Vallejo por aceptar participar el día de hoy como comentarista de esta sesión. La doctora López Vallejo de la Universidad de Guadalajara es una entusiasta colaboradora de este seminario y de otros proyectos previos con el CISAN y la Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México. Y en estos años he sido testigo, con mucho gusto, cómo Marcela se ha convertido en un referente en México en temas de América del Norte. Por ello, expreso mi agradecimiento público por su colaboración permanente con todos nosotros. Muchas gracias, Marcela, por participar el día de hoy con nosotros. Finally, I invite you to follow our most recent studies publications on Canada at CISAN, which is undoubtedly, for me, the most important research center in Mexico and Latin America on North American issues. This is for more than 3 decades. Now, I give the floor to our friend, Maestra Claudia Lucotti, who is co-coordinator of this seminar, and she will be in charge of moderating this session with distinguished colleagues. Thank you very much, and go ahead, Claudia. Bye-bye.
Ok, hola nuevamente, todas, todos. As there are sort of 20 minutes for each and then probably questions and interesting discussions, we'll get going right away. And I'll start off then with Rebecca. Hello, Rebecca Hall. She's an assistant professor in the Department of Global Development Studies at Queen's University, Canada, as she told us a minute ago. A feminist political economist, which sounds very interesting. Her research has explored the gender dynamics of resource extraction in Canada, social reproduction and caring labors, ongoing processes of settler colonialism and gender violence. Her 2022 book, REFRACTED Economies, Diamond Mining and Social Reproduction in the North, examines these gender dynamics of diamond mining in the Northwest Territories. So, Rebecca, adelante, por favor.
Gracias. It's very nice to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm going to try to share my screen here. I have a little PowerPoint to share. Okay, is that coming up there?
Yeah.
Yeah, great. All right, so as Claudia mentioned, I recently published a book called Refracted Economies, Diamond Mining and Social Reproduction in the North, and that's what I'll be speaking about today. So the book examines experiences of the diamond industry, the Canadian diamond industry, which is in the Northern Territory, the Northwest Territories. And it examines people's experiences mostly with a focus on labor and on gendered labor. So most of my work was in partnership with Northern Indigenous women. Today, what I'll do is I'll begin by just grounding my research a little bit, telling you a little bit about how I came to this work and offering some background on the Canadian diamond industry. I'll then get into my methods and my theoretical approach, and then I'll tell some stories of extraction. And I'll look at both stories from the mine site itself and also stories from the communities that have been impacted by these mines. So to begin, I'm from Southern Canada myself, from Ontario, but I moved up to the Northwest Territories many years ago and worked with the Native Women's Association as a frontline worker for people who were survivors of gender violence. And the rates of gender violence are very high in the Northwest Territories, about 10 times higher than the Canadian average. But often when gender violence is reported about in mainstream media, it's seen as a problem from issues from the past. So a problem of past colonial processes or a problem of more individualized problem. So after doing this work for some years and eventually coming to academia, I wanted to think through gender violence more structurally. And in particular, I wanted to think about it in relation to the ongoing colonial shifts that were occurring in the Northwest Territories. And that was how I ended up coming to the diamond industry. The diamond industry is a relatively novel industry for Canada. The first diamond mine opened up in the Northwest Territories in 1998. And since then, 3 more have opened. And it really is a huge part of the territorial economy. At its most, it was accounting for 50% of the territorial GDP. And you can also, when you live there, you feel the impact of the diamond mines everywhere. I took this picture in the territorial capital, Yellowknife, and the diamond mines operate through a fly-in, fly-out structure. So people go and they work at the diamond mines for 2 weeks at a time, and then they come back to Yellowknife or to their home community. And so you feel that rhythm, you feel the people, the restaurants filling up, the stores filling up in these 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off shifts. So all of this led me to ask the question of how the diamond mines, as an example of ongoing colonial extractive projects, how they were impacting the lives of Indigenous women in particular. So as far as how I went about doing this research, which originally was my doctoral thesis and then later became this book, I partnered with the Native Women's Association of the Northwest Territories, which is a pan-Indigenous organization, so serving Dene, Inuit, and Métis women in the territory. And we worked together to develop a series of talking circles and interviews with folks to get a sense of how their lives had changed as a result of the mines. And this map here is a little grainy, but there's a circle around the region of study. So that's the territory there that you're looking at. It's just above the province of Alberta. And I was based in Yellowknife and then working with 2 Dene First Nations, the Yellowknife's Dene First Nation and the Cleacho Dene First Nation, and the communities that were in driving distance, because a lot of these communities are fly-in, fly-out communities. All right. So in terms of how I approached this topic, something that's worth noting about the Northwest Territories at the outset is that its economy is characterized as a mixed economy. And what I mean by that is that a significant proportion of the folks living in the Northwest Territories, and especially Indigenous peoples, continue to meet their day-to-day needs through a combination of wage labor and labors on the land. So trapping, hunting, fishing, preparing foods communally, that sort of thing. So that, knowing that it was important to me when I was thinking about the impact of the diamond mines to not just focus on the impact of jobs, but to look at how these mines were impacting people's labors, land-based labors, and also their caring labors. So this was the approach that I took here, and thinking about capitalist production, capitalist production here in thinking of the work at the diamond mines. Most of the territorial reporting on impacts of the diamond mines was focused on employment, and employment was sort of seen as a marker of socially responsible development. So every year there are major reports that come out that speak to all the Northerners who are working in the diamond mines. But then I also looked at people's engagement in land-based labor and how that had shifted. And land-based labor here, I'm talking about both going out on the land, but also the communal activities that are involved in, preparing animal products and working with fish and that sort of thing. And then social reproduction here, I'm referring to, broadly speaking, the processes of life making. So caring for one another, caring for the land, and what I came to in the book is that social reproduction, all of that, the act of caring at both sort of an individual and a family level, but also at a community level, it really sits in tension with, on the one hand, the demands of the diamond mines, and on the other hand, the commitments to caring for the land and reproducing the land-based relations. So what I'll do now is I'll take these 3 circles that you see here, and I'll go through some of the stories of extraction that I heard and how they relate to these different kinds of labor. So first capitalist production. So as scholars of Canada will know, Canada is no stranger to resource extraction. It's been a pillar of settler development since the beginning, since early fishing and fur trade operations. And in the North, this emphasis on resource extraction is really only intensified. But there were a few aspects of the diamond mines and the characteristics of its wage labor that really distinguished it from past forms of extraction. So one of the things was that this was, as I mentioned, operating through a fly-in, fly-out model. So mines in the region of the past usually had towns built around the mine. So most people who worked for the mine would live adjacent to the mine and work in a sort of 9-to-5 schedule. But because all of these mines were hundreds of kilometers away from where people live, they were built through the fly-in, fly-out model. So there's no town, but there's a camp on site. And so people live at the camp for usually about 14 days and then go to their home communities for 14 days. And this has a few implications for the workers. One of them is that the workers aren't necessarily living in the North. So a number of workers come from outside the territory and then fly straight back to their home in different parts of Canada. And the other major change, because there's no longer a real emphasis on the infrastructure associated with sort of maintaining a social life around the mine, jobs tended to be characterized by a much higher degree of precariousness and temporariness. So many people wouldn't work in the mines for a very long time. I often, asked the workers if they knew if they were unionized, and they often didn't know. Usually they were, but sometimes they weren't. But even when they did know, it didn't have a big impact on their workplace because they were there for such short stints. So that's the first characteristic of the work at the mines that was quite different than mines of the past. And the second is that there was a real focus on hiring Indigenous workers. Indigenous peoples of the North have always been involved in Northern extraction. Their expertise has always been relied upon, especially when it comes to exploration. But often that kind of reliance on Indigenous labors and on Indigenous expertise has been relatively informal and sort of invisibilized in informal work arrangements. But that was really different when it came to the establishment of the diamond mines. The Dene, which is one of the First Nations in the region, had been organizing for decades around greater self-determination of their lands. And one of the ways the Canadian state responded to it was through employment. So sort of saying that we're going to keep doing these mining operations, but we're going to work harder to hire local Indigenous people. So the rate of Indigenous employment is about 25% across the diamond industry in the Northwest Territories. And Indigenous peoples have taken a range of jobs, but they do tend to be hired in the more precarious and lower paid positions. Now, how am I doing for time? I'm trying to stick to 20 minutes. Okay so far?
Yeah. All goes well.
Okay, great. All right. So I won't speak for too long about subsistence production, but only to say there's an interesting tension. So again, subsistence production is also known as traditional labor, land-based labor. And when you look at corporate reporting on the diamond industry in Canada and also state reporting, there's this idea that because the work is fly in, fly out, it's actually quite friendly to subsistence labor because there's a notion that Indigenous workers can go and engage in land-based labor in their time off. And certainly I did hear sort of one-off examples of people finding time to do that, but for the most part, this really wasn't the case. Instead, I heard stories of a real generational gap in the transmission of intergenerational knowledge of the land because people were away from their homes so much of the time. And subsistence work is very much seasonal work that can't be determined by, the shifts of the diamond mines. So often, I heard many stories of people missing hunts, for example, or just not having the time when they were home for a short period of time to engage in subsistence. And I would say most significantly, when I asked questions about subsistence, the concern that people raised was this loss of intergenerational knowledge. One research participant said, we have a lost generation, and it was the generation of workers who were really targeted for work in the diamond mines and weren't able to pick up the knowledge from their elders. And this concern about intergenerational transmission of knowledge is really a concern about the social reproduction of particular modes of life and communities. And so that brought me to this idea of social reproduction as a site of tension between sort of reproducing the worker for the diamond mines and reproducing land-based relations in community. So that's what I'll talk about a little bit now, turning to social reproduction. So when social reproduction came up, and again, this is really, we're talking about caring labor, so care in the home and care in the community. This ended up being, I would say, both the primary site of embodied experiences of extractive violence. So some of the most intense impacts of the diamond mines manifested themselves in the spheres of caring labor, but also the biggest site of resistance. And I'll talk a little bit about both those things. So when it comes to the harmful impacts of the diamond mines, the first and really the most visible one is that, of course, the workers are away for more than half the time. So you see this experience where, as a number of the research participants said, people feel like they're working in their homes as single parents because their spouse is gone for so much of the time. So this creates on the one hand, an intensification of the labor in the home and the labor in the community for everybody who's left, who's not working at the diamond mines, and then also a sort of restructuring of the ways in which people are working. And what I mean by restructuring is that a lot of the communities who are engaged in the diamond mines had not had deep engagement with this sort of wage labor before. So there was a lot of communal interaction when it came to social reproduction. But once people started working in the diamond mines, the household level labor became so much more intense because someone was away all the time that people said, I don't have time to work with my community anymore. I don't have time to sort of engage in these traditional labors the way that I used to. So it became much more of a kind of classic Western male breadwinner, female caregiver model that was quite intense because it had this spatial articulation where, you know, the place of work, the sort of male place of work is hundreds of kilometers away from the place of home. But as I said, although this was the space where people talked about the most harmful impacts, it was also where people got excited about resistance. And one of my sort of favorite examples of this resistance is speaking to folks, you know, executives in the diamond industry. They would often say, we can't recruit women. We're having this real problem with recruiting women to work in the mines, especially Indigenous women. And they saw this as, you know, Indigenous women not being able to figure out how to get a job or something like that. And for many of the women I spoke to, they said it was really a politics of refusal. They said, no, like, we don't want to work in these mines, and we're prioritizing the care of our communities, and we're prioritizing the care of our kin and choosing not to work in those mines. And there's a great deal of pride associated with not engaging in this extractive project. And there was also resistance in finding ways to reproduce communities, so reproduce Indigenous language acquisition, working on the land, both at the mine site and away from the mine site. So I spoke with women who did work at the mine site who found ways to get on the land at the mine and, for example, pick medicines and that sort of thing. There were also small language groups that developed at the mining camp so that people did find a way to maintain and reproduce culture even in the face of this large distance from their home community.
Rebecca,
and so,
just to tell you, you've got about 5 more minutes plus minus, just so that you know, no, we're not being too strict, but.
Well, that's great. I have 1 slide left, so I think I will be just fine with the 5 minutes. So when I heard these stories, the finding was that rather than failing to integrate into the diamond mining regime, many women were telling their stories of successfully reproducing an orientation towards communal needs or subsistence. And this also brought a sort of a nuanced approach to wage labor and a reminder that not all wage labor is the same. So when women were refusing to work in the diamond mines, it's not that they were refusing wage work, but it's that they were insisting upon wage work that better fit with their values and with their other responsibilities, even if it was at a much lower pay rate, which it usually was. So just a few implications here. Whoops. So taken together, what can the analysis of these 3 forms of production tell us about the initial research question that I raised, which was the impact of the diamond mines on the gender relations of the Northwest Territories regional economy? And what findings or implications might be generalizable for broader analysis of Northern economies, resource extraction, and gender? So capitalism in the abstract has a totalizing impulse, and concretely, the diamond mines brought new pressures upon the mixed economy in and around Yellowknife. We find that the diamond mining regime is structured through a settler ideology that masculinizes capitalist production. So it became this very male space, hyper-masculine space, and feminizes social reproduction, intensifying that labor while obscuring subsistence altogether. So as a result, the diamond mining regime has created barriers to the social reproduction of the Indigenous economy. But I suggest that in expanding our conception of production, as we've seen here, Indigenous women's decolonizing labor is made visible. And in the faces of the pressures of the diamond mining regime, research participants noted that they successfully carved out the space to socially reproduce their communities and thereby facilitate land-based labors. It's these day-to-day labors, difficult and sometimes messy, that resist the totalizing impulses of capital and reproduce the mixed economy as just that, mixed. And in closing here, I wanted to highlight the temporariness of all this whole regime. So as I mentioned, the first diamond mine only opened in 1998, and already we're seeing a very intense contraction of the mines. One of the mines has already closed, another is in the process of a planned closure, and the other two will likely only be around for maybe another 10 years. So it offers this moment to consider what might be next, and the possibility of new community development projects that are grounded in Indigenous-led approaches to the future. And that's actually where my research has gone. So I'm working with, again, 2 Dene communities to imagine what a post-extractive future might look like in the Northwest Territories. All right, I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Hi, Rebecca. Thank you. Thank you. This was really great. We've got lots to think about and perhaps lots of questions at the end. Muchas gracias. Bien, pues continuamos para ya pasar a los 20 minutos de Jeffrey. Jeffrey Reitz is he's Professor Emeritus of Sociology, E.R.F. Harney Professor Emeritus of Ethnic Immigration and Pluralism Studies. He's published extensively on immigration and intergroup relations in Canada from comparative perspectives, and has frequently contributed to discussions of policies on immigration, multiculturalism, and minority group employment in Canada. He is the co-author of Multiculturalism and Social Cohesion, Potential and Challenges of Diversity. Recent articles have appeared in the International Migration Review, Ethnic and Racial Studies, the Journal of Ethnic and Migration Studies. Professor Reitz served as chair in the University of Toronto's Department of Sociology, and he contributed for many years at the Centre for Industrial Relations and Human Resource Management. From 1999 to 2020, he was R.F. Harney Professor and Director of the Ethnic Immigration and Pluralism Studies Program. And in 2022, he brought the program to the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. In 2000-2001, he was the Mackenzie King Visiting Professor of Canadian Studies at Harvard, and he's been visiting professor or visiting scholar at universities in the US, the UK, Japan, Australia, and Mexico. During 2012 to 14, he was Marie Curie International Fellow at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris, and from 2017 to 18, he was Distinguished Visiting Fellow at the City University of New York Graduate Center. He is a research fellow with the Institute for Research on Public Policy in Montreal. Thank you, Jeffrey. We'll be listening to your talk, Popular Multiculturalism as Social Capital, Trends and Perspectives.
Well, thank you very much, Marcela, for that introduction. Thanks to Camelia for inviting me to participate in this event. I should say I'm very pleased to be joining you from Mexico City, where I'm normally, of course, living in Canada, but I'm in Mexico City. That accounts for the sparse decoration behind me. I don't have all the books and so on. Camelia is in the same boat because she's out of her normal place of abode, and so her background is also a little bit sparse. I want to talk about the multiculturalism policy, partly because it's the 50th. It's a policy that's been in place for now over 50 years in Canada. It needs an assessment. We generally assume that it has an important impact in managing intergroup relations in Canada compared to other countries that don't have a multicultural policy, such as the United States or France or other European countries, or even it may have an impact different from countries like Australia or UK or Netherlands, who have a kind of multicultural policy, but maybe not as firmly embraced as it is in Canada. And of course, the impact of multiculturalism is of interest, I think, today because of the fact that European countries have, in many cases, retreated from multiculturalism or regarded it as a failure. So in my view, and I'll present some evidence to support the idea that the impact of multiculturalism in Canada stems both from the policy itself as implemented by governments and popular support for multiculturalism as it is understood by the Canadian public. Popular multiculturalism embodies certain ideals for a culturally diverse society to which its adherents, or most Canadians, are committed, the source of much of the impact of multiculturalism in Canada. Popular multiculturalism, I would put forward, as a form of social capital in the broadest sense of that term. It constitutes a social resource enabling society to achieve its collective goals of enhancing relations among cultural groups. The uses of this resource, of course, depends entirely on what Canadians believe multiculturalism is all about. And this meaning has changed over time. Understanding multiculturalism as social capital, I think, is essential to assessing its impact, past, present, and in the future. And the future is important because of the new focus in Canada on specific issues, especially anti-Black racism and anti-Indigenous racism, which have dominated the media in the last few years. Describing popular meaning of multiculturalism requires, wait, I've got a text here, but it's not responding to my, okay, here we go. To describe it, popular multiculturalism requires attention to certain aspects. One is the cultural groups on which it focuses. Canadian multiculturalism policy has always officially emphasized immigrant groups, but the popular understanding of multiculturalism may draw inferences about its broader application to French or English linguistic communities, Indigenous peoples, or specific immigrant groups. A second aspect concerns which multiculturalism cultural ideals are emphasized: cultural development, equity and equal treatment, support for celebration of immigration and diversity generally. And a third concerns the personal imperative attached to such support, whether it includes support for specific multicultural programs only, or policies across departments or levels of government, and also the personal commitments to multicultural ideals that it may engender. So, you know, the data on all these things are limited. So what I have to say about it is quite speculative. And I'm going to talk about three different periods of time since multiculturalism was introduced in 1971. The first period, we'll argue, the emphasis was on ethnic culture and ethnic cultural retention from about 1971 to 1985. Then from 1985 until about 1995, the emphasis focus shifted toward equity issues. And then in the period after 1995, the emphasis, I think, has been on support for expansion of immigration. So I want to talk about each of those three periods of time. The policy initially emphasized support for immigrant minority cultures. Multiculturalism was launched in the wake of Quebec's Quiet Revolution. And while support for French language was being strengthened, immigrant communities, mostly from Europe at the time, were offered support to maintain their cultures, including languages, something many of them had requested. In particular, Ukrainian Canadians were vocal in requesting that. The popular reaction outside immigrant minorities, well, a national survey at the time showed most people were unaware of the term multiculturalism, totally new to them. And when the question was posed, they were mildly favorable. They tended to agree that the value of minority cultures, both in the groups in question and in society as a whole, was important. In other words, they supported the cultural emphasis in multiculturalism, despite unfamiliarity with the term. However, this support was limited. While most people were fine with activities such as ethnic festivals, they didn't want ethnic cultures represented in mainstream institutions such as schools and in mainstream media, and they didn't want tax money spent on it. And there was also a linguistic divide, with Francophone Canadians less favorable, seeing support for immigrant cultures as weakening their own cultural position in Canada, and preferring what they would now call interculturalism, allowing the Quebec government to prioritize French culture in a way that the federal government under multiculturalism is not supposed to be prioritizing the dominant culture in the country. Social capital created by support for the emerging multicultural policy was limited to endorsement of cultural maintenance with no broader implications or commitments, personal or otherwise. In this context, multicultural policy remained low key and public funding did not survive many rounds of budget cuts. In 1982, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms was drafted to include a clause with Section 27 of preserving multicultural heritage, following the policy emphasis on culture. The charter was supported broadly, except in Quebec. So the initial multicultural policy mentioned, but did not emphasize equality, and that changed in the 1980s. Racially restricted immigration regulations had been replaced in the 1960s with selection based on employment qualifications, opening opportunities for immigrants from all over the world, thus creating a greater Canadian diversity in culture, race, and religion. Issues of discrimination and equality quickly emerged, and the famous multicultural parliamentary report, Equality Now, focused on people described by the newly coined term visible minorities. A flurry of policy changes ensued. A 1983 Royal Commission on the Equality of Employment, the commission chaired by Rosalie Abella, a prominent jurist who later became a member of the Canadian Supreme Court, recommended policies to increase equality for women, Native people, disabled persons, and visible minorities. And based on the commission's report, the 1985 Employment Equity Act established a proactive process for removing barriers to equal employment opportunity among federally regulated employers for all four of those designated groups I mentioned. The 1988 Canadian Multiculturalism Act emphasized equity, promising not only to recognize and promote cultural issues, but also to, quote, promote the full and equitable participation of individuals and communities of all origins in society. The Canadian Race Relations Foundation was passed, the act to establish that was passed in 1991, and the multiculturalism program itself added an anti-racism component. Now, the popularity of linking multiculturalism to equity was, in my view, not at all clear. European origin immigrant minorities, the initial focus of multicultural policy, were more concerned with culture than equity. The 1972 survey showed only Italians and Portuguese gave equity as much support as cultural issues. And while the mainstream population's sympathy with European communities continued, a 1991 survey in Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver showed relatively less acceptance of other groups, findings suggestive of racism. For some, resistance to a stronger link between multiculturalism and equity reflected the idea that openness to cultural diversity is sufficient in itself to assure equal opportunity. In fact, the multiculturalism minister used this argument to support a key feature of the Employment Equity Act, which weakened the Abella Commission's recommendations. Abella had recommended equity law be enforced in a process independent of influence, political influence. But in Parliament, the multiculturalism minister referred to the, quote, goodwill inherent in Canadian society, saying persuasive approach was a better way to deal with employer discrimination than the coercive approach used elsewhere. Abella also argued without success that enforcement should emphasize specific minorities most affected, such as Blacks, and not the broader visible minority category, the preferred reference point for popular Canadian thinking about discrimination. Tellingly, in Ontario, broad employment equity legislation introduced by an NDP government in 1993 prompted a powerful public backlash, leading to its swift repeal by the Conservatives in 1995. And since then, equity issues across Canada have focused on the relatively limited issue of immigrant skill utilization, which affects their economic contribution to the economy, while disregarding the economic costs of discrimination to immigrants themselves, which is actually a much larger impact. Emphasis on equity may have made multiculturalism policy politically vulnerable. In the wake of controversy over Canadian novelist Neil Basunda's 1994 book called Selling Illusions, The Cult of Multiculturalism in Canada, which blamed multiculturalism for limiting his career by stereotyping him in ethnic terms, the federal government seriously considered abandoning multiculturalism altogether. So there was a shift, and in mid-1990s, immigration policy entered an era of expansion, and the numbers of immigrants admitted annually jumped from an average of about 140,000 during 1971 to 1990 to nearly 250,000 between 1991 to 2019, an increase of 75%. Surprising to many, the popularity of immigration also increased. Polling data showed continued support for immigration, and acceptance of refugees increased. Efforts by some politicians to exploit public opposition to immigration failed. Current government plans further increases to immigration. Canadian popular support stands in marked contrast to surging anti-immigrant sentiment in other countries, including the US, UK, and France. So what accounts for this Canadian exceptionalism on immigration? Some credit multiculturalism, saying the Canadian ideal has promoted immigration and bolstered Canadian openness to diversity. Certainly, multiculturalism is a salient feature of the Canadian identity, and the link between multiculturalism and immigration remains strong in the public mind, according to public opinion polls. Two strong, important caveats apply here. First, while support for multiculturalism is strong, with roots in popular multiculturalism, it does not follow that greater strength of Canadian support for immigration is necessarily explained by any greater openness to diversity. Attitudes to immigration in a country are strongly related to the specific immigrants it receives. And unlike elsewhere, Canada's immigrants normally arrive with an invitation from the government in hand. And immigrant selection emphasizes education and other issues to ensure the employability and economic contribution. Accordingly, more than others, Canadians view immigration as an economic benefit. Canadian geography and history also play a role. Canada does not have a border with poor countries, and a former colony itself, Canada does not have obligations to former colonial territories. The harsh
Jeffrey,
response.
Sorry, just to let you know, you've got about 5 more minutes plus minus, just a friendly reminder.
Thank you very much. Just as Rebecca, I think that fits perfectly with my planning, so thank you. I was talking about the response of, in terms of openness of Canadians to undocumented immigration. The response to the arrival of some years ago on Vancouver Island of a few hundred undocumented boat people of Chinese origin suggests Canadians would not welcome a massive flow of undocumented immigrants, such as the US has experienced at the Mexican border. Canadian openness to diverse, and I can cite other examples as well, including recently immigrants crossing the border from the US into Canada. which is met with a significant amount of controversy. Canadian openness to diversity compared to other countries is best measured using survey data, avoiding terms with country-specific meanings like multiculturalism and immigration. And suddenly Canada doesn't look so exceptional. International surveys show Canadians and Americans are equally likely to express support for ethnic groups to maintain their customs rather than blend into society. Only a minority favored this option in either country. They were equally likely to agree that distinct minority communities can become full members of national societies. So I think evidently multicultural values are not restricted to countries with an official multicultural policy or countries where immigration is popular. The second important caveat to Canada's immigration and its policy of multiculturalism does not mean that its earlier reluctance to address disadvantage has been overcome. Public support for multiculturalism may have increased, but persuasive and well-publicized evidence of discrimination, such as from the 2011 study by Phil Oreopoulos, the economist, showing continued anti-Asian racism pervasive in hiring processes by employers, prompted no increased public appetite to address it. And moreover, economic disparities of immigrants of specific origins are as great in Canada as in comparable immigration countries. For example, studies of Black immigrants in the US and Canada show about equal disadvantage relative to qualifications. Same is true for Chinese, South Asian, and other minorities. My own most recently published research shows that even in countries as different in their approaches to immigration as France and Canada, after taking account of the personal differences in personal characteristics of the immigrants, such as their race, religion, and level of education, and the respective labor market and social welfare regimes of the two countries, comparable groups of immigrants are as frequently report discrimination and show comparable degrees of social well-being and employment success relative to qualifications. The Muslim gap in Canada and France relative to qualifications and institutional arrangements is roughly the same. The social capital represented in strong support for multiculturalism during a period of expanding immigration gives politicians considerable flexibility in immigration and refugee policy, very different from the US and Europe. But this does not mean that Canadians are less likely to discriminate against minorities or more likely to favor anti-discrimination policies. So my conclusion is that while social capital arising from support for multiculturalism in Canada has increased, and its content has emphasized support for cultural diversity and expansion and expansive immigration, but not equity. Will this change? There's been a surge in attention, as I mentioned, to anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism in Canada, reinforced by media storms on two major stories: the resonance in Canada of the murder of George Floyd at the hands of Minneapolis police, and the disturbing revelations about the abuse of Indigenous children forced to attend residential schools. A recent survey on race relations by Environics Institute identified Blacks and Indigenous people as by far the most affected by racism and discrimination in Canada. Such evidence of anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism has punctured Canadian pride in celebrating diversity, but does the social capital inherent in support for multiculturalism encourage greater public interest in actually addressing this racism? I think not. Multiculturalism has not provided the social capital useful as a political resource to address discrimination and disadvantage in general, and has not emphasized any obligations to groups experiencing the most virulent racism, Indigenous people and Blacks. And even today, while acknowledging problems facing Blacks and Indigenous peoples, most Canadians describe race relations and the treatment of racial minorities as positive overall. If this doesn't change, multiculturalism risks being irrelevant to addressing anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism in Canada. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias, Jeffrey. Creo que there will be questions at the end about all this. Thank you very much. Bueno, pues entonces vamos ahora a pasar con Camelia Tigau, quien es a full at the Center for Research on North America, National Autonomous University of Mexico. Bueno, del CISAN de la UNAM, digamos. And she's currently appointed as a visiting professor at the Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, University of Toronto. She is a regional vice president of the Global Research Forum on Diasporas and Transnationalism. Her academic publications address skilled migration, scientific diplomacy, and Canadian studies. And in 2022, she received the Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz Award for Outstanding Women Scientists at UNAM. Camelia's talk will be on the Second Life, Intellectual Exile and Deskilling in Canada. Bueno, gracias, Camelia. Adelante. Micrófono.
Okay. Now, so hello everyone, and I'll present as you've been announced. Some of you know that this whole session was around my sabbatical in Canada, which kind of puts pressure on what I'm going to present. But well, anyway, the talk is about skill migration and the intellectual exile, as Claudia has said, and it's situated in Canada, not only because it's a very interesting country, but also because it's a country of it's sort of an example of hospitality on an international level. It's a welcoming place for migrants, so many people consider it as a model in terms of what policies should look like. This research is not finished, so I'm gonna present what I'm doing now. The argument here is the contents of the presentation is on skilled forced migration. As you know, the skilled migration has been treated in academic literature before mainly as economically induced migration. I'm gonna find a different side to it. It's forced migration, and how underemployment or de-skilling in these migrants affect their emotional, the emotions, their health. What are their rational responses to the crisis, and also what are their perspectives on how the situation can improve on the international level. So what I'm looking at is how to maybe give a second opportunity to this R2P principle, responsibility to protect, and maybe try to figure out a way to involve the migrants' perspective for a different, non-official and non-interventionist perspective on R2P. This discussion of R2P applied to refugee protection started in 2005. It was supposed to mean that those people who are chased because of genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, crimes against humanity, they should receive protection. And it also had a sort of a self-interest from the receiving countries, because even political leaders said we have to protect these leaders, not only because they need to be protected, but because an unsafe world is unsafe for everyone. So in this, from this perspective, it was adopted. And there have been some studies on international protections linked to refugee, not very many. I'm going to quote here just to recall the study of Panebianco and Fontana. They take the 3 pillars and the responsibility to protect. Pillar 1 is the protection of the population. Pillar 2 is this principle of solidarity, and pillar 3 is provide an alternative to military intervention. And the potential measures are, of course, offering asylum, resettlement, relocation, etc. So this is what the previous studies are dealing with. My objective is to redefine this responsibility to protect from the perspective of intellectual exiles that I'm interviewing in Canada, and a little bit change the discussion from whom to how and what actors should be involved in the protection rather than who needs protection. It's clear who needs protection, but can it be done in a better way? And what I found is maybe a bit aggressive, but I think that underemployment of these skilled refugees is a way to breach responsibility to protect. When we see all these people in Canada that are, medical doctors working as taxi drivers, or this kind of the jobs that don't really require a lot of studies, then I think it's not a way to comply with this responsibility to protect. So I started with the results of the study. Maybe I don't have enough time. So if I don't have enough time, I've already told you the conclusion. But anyway, according to what I've seen in my studies, the responsibility to protect, according to refugees, skilled refugees, should go beyond the governmental intervention. And I put here four levels of the responsibility to protect, 4 types of actors. First, they believe that the civil society should be involved, and it is very much involved in Canada. Of course, by accepting, not discriminating those newcomers, but also getting more involved in philanthropic actions. Then they talk about the government, what the governments can do. They can, of course, get involved in rescue, integration, offer pathways to credential recognition and reskilling, housing, offering housing, education, offering a collective action in the international institutions, like lobbying for refugees, negotiating more, putting sanctions on governments of where the refugees come from, where wars and all these situations of conflict come from. They should get more involved in conflict prevention and offer financial support. What can companies and financial institutions do? Well, of course, offer loans, employment to skilled refugees according to their level. And then there is a responsibility of the refugees themselves towards refugees. And this is very interesting in Canada. And I think it's interesting to know as a good practice of policy. First, the refugees think that they are responsible towards the countries of destination, like they are grateful to the country where they arrive, so they want to give something back. They many times they say, "Oh, I want to, get a good job and pay taxes and feel like a citizen." And then they are also trying to support other refugees. Like many of the associations of refugees in Canada are formed by refugees themselves, or previous migrants. So this is like a learning process that is part of this social reproduction, if I can call it like this, quoting from what Rebecca Hall was saying. And then refugees feel responsible towards the places or the people they left, this kind of survival responsibility. They think, why me and not other people have survived? Why could I make it abroad? So they are responsible, and they want many of them to speak about the conflict. Some of them don't want to speak about the conflict to protect the families back home. Some of them think that they shouldn't speak about the conflict because they are not for studies, but that's another attitude. Then refugees, normally, even if they're skilled, they send financial remittances when possible and needed, which is kind of different from economic migration. And of course, they get involved in many cases of diaspora organization and diplomacy. So this is like the background of what I found, but now I'm going to go to describe what actually how I came to this. Okay. So I think okay. So I chose qualitative methods, a survey and some interviews. In total, I interviewed 33 people with migrants and talent organizations, which is talent organization is a special figure we don't have in Mexico. It's like recruiting people from abroad, and even though they are refugees or because they are refugees, they should be recruited. These people are normally resettled in Ontario, Alberta, British Columbia, and Quebec. I think it's sort of where most of the refugees go also. So I coded, of course, transcribed those interviews, coded them in 4 groups, like 4 topics, big topics, pre-migration, which is the conflicts they left, migration-induced conflicts, which is what happened in the process of migration. Then they have some conflict that we could call beyond migration, like identity conflicts or this type of conflicts. And then what I'm looking at, what are their emotional and rational responses to those conflicts and crises. And most of the interviews and the ones who responded to the survey, I chose just a little comment here on the method. I chose a double method survey and interview because some of them don't want to speak. So I thought maybe if they answer the survey, they feel it's more anonymous, even though I assure them that if they don't want to be quoted with their names, I won't quote them. But anyway, they are more reluctant to speak to me, and they show a less interest, or maybe they are afraid to speak much more than economic migrants. So that's why we had this survey also. In the survey and in the interviews, they showed 30% said they have experienced some wage theft or underpayment because of their condition as migrants or refugees. And most of them have some sort of visa, either humanitarian, they got refugee, they got a work permit. So this is why I'm working with intellectual exile. I broadened the concept of forced displacement, because if I only chose refugees, then it's a very specific population. But anyway, there are more people displaced by conflicts who can access other types of visas that are not refugee visas. And some of them, like here, undocumented, they don't get any visa, or they overstay some visitor visa. Well, this is sort of an abstract of the how it looks, their job integration. I would say most of them have to change occupation or work in something else, which is most of the times underemployment. Then some chose different path, like studying again what they had already studied or a different occupation or profession. And then I found it only 23% had the same occupation, like if they were lawyers in their home country, they became lawyers again. This has consequences, serious consequences in their health. They suffer from depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, even mental illness. They cannot sleep. They suffer from arthritis, digestive problems, sour throat, high blood pressure, unhappiness. They feel demotivated, anxious. Like this guy from Uganda said, at times I wake up seeing people in army uniform and my heart feels like I'm in danger. The people I study come from these countries to Canada. So there are some Mexicans that they say are displaced by violence or kidnappings. Venezuela, of course, they are a very important crisis. Then we have some African countries, Uganda, they are very moved by this situation where they had a dictator for 36 years. And we have a lot of people from this region, which is Syria, Iran, Afghanistan. We have people from, of course, displaced by the Ukrainian war, the war in Ukraine. And well, they show, I interviewed some people from Yemen also. I'm trying to, this is not like a complete map of all the conflicts that are occurring in the world and trying to find somebody in Canada, but anyway, it's like a way to look at how the world is structured nowadays and how it's well, torn away by conflict. So this is a map of how I coded the interviews. As I was saying, I identify some pre-migration or home conflict, why they left in the first place. Of course, because of there was brain drain at home also. They were abused intellectually, some of that they couldn't practice their profession even at home, because in the war you cannot really practice, or you have to practice too much in the case of medical doctors. What can I say? Restriction on the freedom of speech is a big issue because of corruption and impunity. For instance, even population that we would say they are only displaced by war, such as Iran or Syria, they also mention corruption as a big driver of migration. And then they mention on the international level the foreign intervention, like they say, this is not just a situation produced by home country conflict, but it's because some foreign countries have gone to where I was born and made a war. They mentioned the pandemics, even though it's not a big issue for them. Like the whole situation of displacement, it's far more traumatic than the pandemic in itself. Then we have migration-induced conflicts. It's just like what happened on the way to safety. So here we can see there is a social and political context that can be friendly, such as in Canada. There are many challenges. I'm not going to read the whole model if you're interested.
Camelia, again, just a friendly reminder, around 5 minutes plus
yes.
minus.
And then we have, okay, so I was talking about the social and political context. We have challenges of how to integrate to obtain their migration status, to get housing, etc. They have challenges of cultural and identity when they face discrimination, but also just like to adapt themselves. It's when you pass from one religion to another, if your religion is different, when you arrive to a new place, then it's a challenge. Then they have conflicts that are related to their families, to their identity in general, to their identity as cosmopolitans. Like some professionals, they need this cosmopolitan environment. They need a place where they can practice their art, for instance, or they can be academics, and Canada is a good place in this sense. Then they talk about their profession, how much they invested in becoming professionals, how they love what they are doing or they were doing. And of course, it becomes tragedy when they cannot practice what they learned the entire life. And then in the end, we have these emotional and rational responses that turn into what I started with, this responsibility to protect perspective. So I see like two types of responses. One could be emotional, what comes from displacement process. What are the emotional costs of it? They are scared in the process, they are guilty, they become sick. And they also present some rational interpretations of conflict, like what can be done. And they, of course, propose these recertification measures. Some of them choose to remigrate or go for a circular migration process. They, for instance, when they don't find work in Canada, they go to work in other countries. They leave the family in Canada. And for instance, they go to work in Saudi Arabia, where they can practice medicine and come back. It's kind of far, I know, but some people do it like this. I've met quite a couple, I don't know, a few people from Syria, they do it. And then what are their objective representations and interpretations of the conflict is also very interesting. They propose negotiation to solve the conflict. They propose refugee recognition. Some of them propose more involvement in the foreign countries to solve the conflict in the countries where they came from, which means not necessarily that their proposals are good, but it's just to listen to their perspectives. Some people say, from Ukraine, for instance, they would say, oh, it would be good if we got more support with the army, like to keep fighting. And well, if we are against the war, it's not necessarily the best position, but anyway. Among the professionals that I interviewed, I'm inserting here a very brief table on interviews from Sudan, Syria, Uganda, Afghanistan, and Venezuela. They are very much concerned about political persecution and escape, about their recertification and unemployment situation. Let's call it unemployment. They talk about why they chose Canada. It's very important. So I think I won't talk about all the conclusions of the study, but I would point to 3 types of alternative refugee diplomacy in Canada that are maybe nice to learn from refugees themselves. The first point is this: refugees, displaced people who help other newcomers. This is like an original approach in Canada. Then they also get involved in rallies and marches abroad, which is may seem very normal for somebody who's in Canada, but in Mexico they cannot really do that. They cannot get involved in local politics too much because there is an article in the Constitution that said the foreigners cannot get involved in the local politics. So then it's not so obvious. And then there is another very nice approach that I found through the private sponsorship, which is civil society actions to help other refugees. I'm going to stop soon. These are the refugee associations, but I'm just going to show you like this is an image I took in High Park with people from Uganda demonstrating against the regime in Canada, right? And this is how people from Ukraine take shelter program in Canada. They live in Toronto. They say sort of remodel their house to receive refugees, and this is kind of very nice to hear from people. They have a life savings that they are investing in refugees, and I found this couple called Linda and Patrick, and they allowed me to take some pictures of their house. So this is where some refugees stayed in Canada, and they are. This is not a governmental initiative, but rather it's civil society. So this is why what I'm talking about when I say responsibility to protect should be different. What we can learn from the Canadian case is very important. I would say I see two solutions. The local approach to integration comes from hybrid diplomacy and involvement of non-state actors with various interests. So we cannot put all the responsibility on the state. And of course, still there is some systemic discrimination and sometimes visible in terms of the experiences of underemployment that can be solved by involving more the companies, the refugees, the NGOs. So again, it's not always the responsibility of the state, but of course, a lot can be done through better legislation. And I'm going to stop here. Thanks.
Camelia, thank you. Muchas gracias. Cerramos ahorita contigo y Marcela, then please, Marcela López Vallejo, who will comment on the three talks. Thank you, Marcela.
Thank you very much. It was lovely to hear the three of you. Well, I'm going to make some three types of comments. One is a series of questions coming out of the lack of expertise of myself to your topics. You are the experts on the topic, so I had some doubts about what you say. The second is, some other questions about the argumentation, and the third one will be in general comments, maybe for the three of you in general. I'm going to start in order. Rebecca, thank you for the work, the presentation, and the book. Of course, congratulations on that. And I was just wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about this model fly in, fly out, which is kind of a commuting, but long distance commuting, right? But who pays for that? Do they have infrastructure to do that? Do they have frequent flights, or is there the company has a plane to transport personnel, or how does it work? And if it's only for specific times that your contracts have, you are hired for 14 days and you come back another 14 and then you go, or is just whenever you want to have a job or not? A little bit more of description of this fly, please. The second question is about that you mentioned that usually they hire indigenous workers because of their expertise on that, but could you explain a little bit more about the other reason, which is exploitation and low wages and the precariousness that you mentioned? Do you have any examples of how precarious these conditions of living are? Because I'm thinking of a very popular program here in Mexico with Canada, which is the PTAT. the seasonal workers program for agriculture. And you know, it's very successful for some and in general, but there have been a lot of human rights violations, especially in the health area and in the day-to-day living up north. So I don't know if this can resemble a little bit the conditions of living of these 14 days in the mine. And the third question, well, I have a lot more, but just to wrap up with you, Rebecca, you mentioned about that, well, men tend to be for mining and for capitalist schemes of work, and women just stay home and they seem to be against it. Why haven't they hired women? That if it's just purely discrimination, or because women don't want to go? That's one. And the second one is there any resistance of men? I don't know if there's resistance, I guess the communities, as happens with all migration processes, just break down and into two: the ones wanting to migrate, the ones fighting for that, and getting all the loads of running the communities and making the communities work where they stay. You know, the original communities. So if this kind of resistance has broken the men-women relationships or the community relationships. And I will stop there with you, Rebecca. Thanks, really, congratulations for this research. Jeffrey, thank you for the presentation. With you, I have a ton of questions. I'm going to try to be brief. There are a lot of critiques to the Canadian multiculturalism, and I would like to hear your opinions about, you know, this very fundamental critique of by respecting the identity and the traditions of each community. What you do is you form ghettos, and those ghettos are fragmenting labor. So, and we can see that in any city in Canada, in Vancouver, all the guys from the taxi drivers are maybe from Pakistan or India. All the guys working in call centers come from I don't know where. And, you know, you fragment labor, and that sets up crystal roofs or limits to development of other sources or skills, right? So I would like to hear your experience on this. The second comment is about, you know, multiculturalism in general, or maybe I'm a little bit updated on that. Tries to as you respect the identity, you get a little bit you get small closed communities. But what I've seen in this century in Canada is that these communities tend to open up to interrelate with others. But I'm not sure if with this trend of nationalisms worldwide, etc., multiculturalism has been taken or interpreted as to close again these communities and fight against cultural communities. For example, you mentioned the attacks on Asians, but I'm not sure if those attacks were performed by Anglo-Saxon Protestants or you know, or other communities as vulnerable as theirs. So I'm not sure if multiculturalism is one of the problems with that policy is that it makes vulnerable communities compete among themselves for resources, for territory, for work, for knowledge, etc. The other question is about lately. I'm just directing a thesis research And my student, she's very worried about labor shortages in Canada. And there are very like scary data that, you know, there are sectors that have shortages, and no one seems to be solving that. And well, the argument is that migration policy has been failing to attract people to get into those specific sectors in need of work, of labor. So I'm not sure if you have heard about it, or if multiculturalism at one point could help attract more people to work in Canada in certain areas, and if that would not bring again more discrimination to this, or vulnerability to these populations. And for Camelia, well, I just haven't heard this word of DESKILLING, so for me it was very, very interesting. And I would like if you could explain a little bit what is DESKILLING. I understand you put a graph on, well, when you go to other country and you are a professional and then you have to do other things. Mm-hmm. But to what level is DESKILLING? Up to which levels? For example, you are a professional in Syria, you're an academic and you go to Canada, but it's very difficult to get a position in any Canadian university. So you start teaching online, but it's very difficult. So you start cooking in a restaurant, but it's very difficult. And then you go in this race to the bottom. I'm not sure until when or until where, or what level of skills is this process going. Because one thing is to de-skill, like, well, I teach math and then I'm teaching, I don't know, biology. But the other one is, well, I teach math in my home country, but now I'm in the construction sector. I'm not sure up to which level. And if well, you have, for example, intellectual skills, I'm not sure how easy it is to get into the world, the labor world of making things, you know, of doing material things, of hard work, to say so, no, like material work. The other question is, well, you mentioned it a little bit, but I understand, and this is very interesting and innovative in my view, Camelia, that you see the, you know, the people's side. You see the refugees' testimonies. You see NGOs. You see all the your research is focused from what, I don't like the word, but from down to top, from the people, from the society. However, I'm not sure if in your research you would be including the policy side, because you know, R2P, and you put it in just your last slide in the conclusions or the findings, is a new proposal on R2P would need to include, you know, the state. And I'm not sure how and to which point, or or your proposal is just to put aside a little bit the state and get more networks or more social work to renew or refresh the idea of R2P. And the same question as to Jeffrey is, have you seen or heard any discrimination but intra-refugee groups? You know, groups coming from Syria discriminating groups coming from Ukraine, or not refugees but the normal migrants. Is there any like fighting or, in the contrary, support for their causes? Because we saw that here in Mexico when Ukrainians arrived here to the Tijuana border, a lot of like migrants from Central America that were waiting there forever to cross were very angry at these newcomers, to say so, that were giving like free pass to the United States. And a lot of testimony was saying that it was discriminatory, that it was because of race, that it was, well, whatever, right? So I'm not sure if in Canada happens the same thing with newcomers or new refugees. And that's it. Thank you very much. It was very interesting to listen to you. And I'm not really having a comment as to like a formal comment because I don't have read your papers. But well, what I could catch on the presentations, well, I hope these questions or these ideas can help you or help everyone understand better what you're researching about. Thank you very much.
Perhaps we'll go in order. Would that be okay? First Rebecca, then Jeffrey, and then Camelia. Does this sound okay with everybody? Okay, hope so. Yep.
Yeah, that sounds good. Thank you. And thank you so much, Marcela, for your comments and your questions. Yeah, really great question. So I'll start with your first question, which was about an elaboration of the fly-in, fly-out work arrangement. And in Canada, this has really become the dominant model of how extraction is organized since the 1990s. And it differentiates according to the extractive industry. So with the diamond mines, it is the company that pays for the flight. So it's these charter flights that bring people up to the mines. Whereas, for example, the oil industry, which is south of the diamond industry, that's a little bit more different. It's not quite as even in that some people are responsible for driving in themselves to camps. Some people have to pay for part of the flight themselves. There's a little bit more, there's less clarity when it comes to the oil industry. But with the diamonds, it is the corporation that pays for the flight, though that has some complications because it means that workers are reliant on the company and on the company schedule in terms of getting in and getting out. There's also just issues, it's a remote area. So often I spoke to workers who are, exhausted after working for these like 12-hour days for 14 days, desperate to get home. And then, there's a whiteout. And so the flight doesn't leave for a long time. And there is only this one flight. So there was this, this uneasy feeling of reliance on these flights for sure. And I also heard about the implications that has for worker organizing, because you can't just go to the work site. Speaking to, for example, union organizers, they said it's much, much harder for us to mobilize people than it was back in the former, the gold mines were there before the diamond mines. So in the gold mining era, the unions were quite strong because they could organize, in the evening in people's homes after they'd been at the mine, but that's more complicated to do with the fly-in, fly-out model. So yeah, it is mostly a 2 weeks in, 2 weeks out shift. And people, you asked as well, do people just get paid for that 2 weeks? There's a real range. There are quite a few jobs that are sort of stable. It's considered full-time work. And so people will have long-term employment at the mines. I've spoken to people who've worked there really since they opened in the late 90s, and they know when their shifts are, they know when they're going to have time off. That kind of thing. And then all the way, it ranges all the way to folks who do have what you describe. And this is particularly in the case of people who work as cooks or cleaners up at the mining camp. Sometimes it is contracts that really are, we need someone for these 14 days. And then we see everything in between that. So I think that answers the first question more or less. And then your second question was asking for some more detail on the dynamics around hiring Indigenous workers. And that really, the new emphasis on hiring Indigenous workers is a convergence of a few different things. I briefly mentioned in the presentation that Northern Indigenous communities, and especially Dene communities, have fought for greater negotiation with communities and a bigger seat at the table when it comes to the development of these extractive operations. And that's led to the requirement that each mine that opens they're called impact benefit agreements with all of the affected communities, and also agreements with the territory on social impact. And one of the primary elements of those agreements is commitments to a certain level of Northern employment. So that's both Indigenous and non-Indigenous Northerners, and then Indigenous employment. And for the most part, those targets don't tend to get met. And that's, like I said, it's often because there's not enough interest on the part of the northern population, the indigenous population, to work in the mines. So that's one of the reasons for that focus. And then the other one is, like I said, the expertise of the indigenous workers, what they know about the land, and their comfort in, quite cold climates, as well as it being less expensive for the mine to fly people from areas that are closer to the mine. So I'd say those are some of the reasons. And then when it comes to the precariousness and the sort of the racial hierarchy that we see, that has to do with the fact that because there are these hiring targets, there was a real push right at the opening of the diamond mines to fill a lot of the sort of so-called lower skilled jobs with local workers, and quite a few of the executive positions, those sorts of things, those positions were filled by people who were flown in from elsewhere, and sometimes flown in internationally, because it is international companies like De Beers is one of the companies that is operating in the north. So that's the second question. And then your third question was about the gender dynamics that I talked about. So why are women not being hired to the same degree that men are being hired? And this question of resistance, both on the part of men and women. And so I think I was definitely trying to show that there is this real kind of masculinist approach to jobs at the mines. And part of that is this sort of this assumption, it's a very heteronormative assumption as well, that, in a household where there are caring responsibilities, there's going to be someone who can be at home to do that care work, whether it's childcare or elder care, what have you, so that someone else is kind of free to be at the mine for these really long stretches of time. And how that has tended to play out has predominantly been that it is the man that goes to the mine and the woman who stays at home. And when I spoke to women who worked at the mine, they often talked about working at the mine as a much more temporary phenomenon. So maybe, when they're younger, in their early 20s, they work at the mine, and then later on, they don't see it as a long-term job prospect in the same way. But certainly there was resistance on all sides, and men too. Men who were mine workers talked a lot about the challenges of, being away from community for so long. And your question reminded me in particular, I remember had a wonderful interview with a young Métis man who said, young Indigenous men are put in this impossible position where we're being told we have to take advantage of this opportunity. You make so much money in the diamond mines, you need to do this, and you need to bring this money back to your community. And at the same time, we're told to take on the responsibility of, being good partners, being good community members, being involved in the community. And he said, and we can't do both. And it's incredibly tiring, and it's an impossible situation that we're in. And I think that his insight there probably applies to quite a few people who have either worked in the diamond mines for a long time and not been a part of those community activities, or who sort of go in and out of that industry.
Rebecca, thank you. And we'll carry on with Jeffrey, please.
Okay, thanks for the question, Marcella. I'll try to be brief. In what I said about multiculturalism impact, the first question was about whether groups tend to become ghettoized. And in answering this question, I want to emphasize that I think the important thing in assessing the impact of multiculturalism is to compare the experience of immigrant groups in different countries. And to avoid simply drawing conclusions based on a philosophical analysis of what would seem to be likely under a particular policy, which is what most of us are doing, and we get arguments, very extreme arguments about the pluses and minuses. But when you compare different countries and you look at, for example, I stressed economic opportunity, but you can look at the question of the formation of ethnic communities and whether people establish relationships and friendships with members of the mainstream society. You don't find big differences across countries when you compare specific groups. And it's important to emphasize to compare specific groups, because if a group is coming into a country, say blacks in Canada, and they encounter a lot of discrimination, and they may form an ethnic community because of that, because of the exclusion from the mainstream society. So you want to compare those folks with similar groups in other countries, Blacks in France or the US. What you find is that they experience discrimination there and also maintain ethnic ties for longer than perhaps some other groups. But for comparable groups, there really is not a lot of difference across country in what happens. That second question was about intergroup conflict and racism within the minority groups. A lot of people say that minorities can't be racist. Of course, they can be racist, but it's generally not a social problem for the society if one group discriminates against another. It's more a social problem created when the mainstream group is discriminating because they're the ones who control the resources, the jobs and access to housing and so on that people want. So I don't know. I don't know of cases where in refugee groups, maybe Camelia can comment on that, where there's been conflicts that have been erupting. On the labor shortage issue, of course, that's very much discussed in Canada. I know that multiculturalism makes Canada more attractive to immigrants. I did a study here in Mexico of potential skilled migrants to Canada with a graduate student, Melissa Hasso, who is currently a PhD student in sociology at Harvard and is going to carry on these kind of studies. Multiculturalism was an attractive feature of Canada. Of course, the weather was not the attractive feature of Canada. So that has to get balanced out. But the Canadian government has certainly been aggressive in offering to employers the opportunity to fill labor shortages by bringing in immigrants from other countries. Of course, most of them want to bring in unskilled immigrants to take the jobs at the lower end. And that's, we've accommodated that. We're taking like 500,000 a year, which is more temporary immigrants than personal immigrants, than permanent immigrants. But the question is the management of those and whether or not it's a good idea to have large numbers of temporary immigrants in the country as opposed to hiring people from within the country. But I think that has very little to do with the multicultural policy, although I agree that multiculturalism has made Canada more attractive. It leads perhaps also to some more disappointment when people find out that, hey, they're actually going to encounter racism and discrimination in Canada, just as in other countries, despite the multicultural promises. I have questions for the other two, so I hope we get time for that.
Okay. Thank you, gracias. Y Camelia, entonces, tus respuestas, por favor.
Okay. So the first question was on deskilling and underemployment, and well, we had a sort of a short conversation with Jeff, and he was saying deskilling for labor studies is just when somebody cannot practice or loses the technical skills because of the technological change. And I understand it differently in my study. I'm thinking when you have certain professional or skills that you cannot practice abroad, which is maybe, I agree, sort of a situation of underemployment. What happens? Well, there are many cases of medical doctors, for instance, who cannot recertificate. So they cannot. Why? Because they cannot study again. They don't have resources to study again. And Canada is a very welcoming place in the sense that you can live here, but nobody will pay for your exams. Therefore, you cannot have access to all these recertification processes if you're not rich or you don't work somewhere else. So I would say I take it also from a subjective point of view, like what is enough for a person? When does a person feel satisfied with what he or she is doing? Sometimes people would be happy with learning again or studying again, and sometimes not. It also connected with the age. You're more eager to learn something new when you're in your 20s. Whereas if you're a medical doctor who had their own, patients and work in a hospital back home. You come to a new place and you cannot even practice your profession, then it's more traumatic. So some people are satisfied even when they work in McDonald's, let's say, and they have university degrees, because they feel it's okay, it's the price I have to pay for being alive. And some people are not satisfied with that because they feel they are double neglected. And the second question was on the responsibility to protect, the role of the state. So I'm seeing it. Yes, I'm trying to do a different reading of the responsibility to protect. It includes the state because I think that international agreements, and actually there is a proposal of the International Labour Organization to consider recertification as an obligation of the states who receive migrants and refugees. Therefore, something can be done on an official level, but there is also a different reading, like what can other people do for migrants and refugees, for vulnerable minorities. And then that's why I'm looking at these civil society participations in Canada that are really interesting. And maybe it's not so easy to find somewhere else. And then there is also a question of Jose Luis Ayala in the chat. And I'm going to connect with what Marcela said. He asked about the role of human capital. Well, for many years, Canada was being criticized because it selected migrants and refugees also based on their skills rather than, in the case of refugees, on humanitarian background. But, of course, the conversation has changed a bit. Canada is far, as you know, so the geography plays a role here because the ones who really get to Canada, migrants and refugees who come from conflicts from Africa or very far away, they are the ones who pay the trip further away. So they are also part of an economic elite. So what's the role of human capital? Of course, it's very important because they are in Canada many times because they are more educated, more economically active, or they can provide more. So in the first place, it's a main role in selection. I will leave it here to hear the comments, more comments.
Okay, thank you, Camelia, and thank you for answering Jose Luis's question. Jeffrey had put his hand up, and Alexandra has a question in the chat. We've got 11 minutes left, so we make the most of it. Jeffrey, I don't know.
Jeffrey is not in the room anymore. Maybe he has problems with the internet.
Yeah, with his. Okay, so perhaps then there's Alexandra's question, no?
It's for Rebecca.
Yeah.
Yeah, Alexandra, you can talk direct. Don't worry.
We cannot hear you.
Thank you. Very wonderful presentations. Just two quick questions for Rebecca. Rebecca, I loved your presentation, and just wondering if you could maybe expand on relations between Indigenous women who engage in non-refusal and those who work in the mines, and speak to the issue of whether are there women who are kind of higher up in the diamond companies, and what are there tensions between the women who work for the mining companies at more of a white collar level? Thanks.
Thank you so much, Alexandra. Those are great questions. So first, to the relationship between Indigenous women who chose not to work in the mines and those who did. One of the interesting things that I found in interviews is that a really significant proportion of the women that I spoke to who initially identified themselves as not working for the mines, as we got into their life history, it turned out that they had worked for the mines at some point. So that often it was sort of the same women who both had that politics of refusal, but then also had picked up the work either, at a time in their lives when they had that capacity, or, a time of financial need when they really, really wanted the job. And then eventually moved away from it. But certainly, there were a lot of tensions, not so much between people working for the mines and not working for the mines, but in the interpretations of that choice. On the one hand, often people spoke with quite a bit of pride when they had family members, men or women, who'd worked in the mines for a long time and who were providing for their extended kin. There was very much an expectation that if you had a long-term high-paying job in the mines, you're not just keeping it for you and your nuclear family, you're spreading the wealth. And so there was that appreciation. And then they would also talk about, and I'm the one who picks up my niece or my nephew every day after school, and I'm the one who looks after our elderly relatives and that sort of thing. So you saw the tension that existed. Then you also, people saw both the benefits, but also the ways in which it was undermining the labor that was happening in the community. And then as for the women taking on higher paid roles, where I saw most of that tension, a few women who had climbed the ladder at the mines spoke more about the discrimination they experienced at the mine site rather than the discrimination that they felt in their home community, and that they described it as both a gendered and a racial discrimination, in that people seem to sort of have ideas about, well, if you're Indigenous and you're a woman and you've climbed the ranks, you must have done something to do that, to get that job. So that was where they talked about the most tension, whereas at home, they felt that their family members were proud of them for that work. And the other thing about the white collar jobs that's interesting is that, again, because of these community agreements, there are more jobs now in communities where people have roles like community liaisons. So they're working for the diamond company, but it's their job to think about community benefits and that kind of thing. And those are really highly sought after jobs because it means you're contributing to your community, but you also have that sort of higher wage, most likely, and cachet of working for the diamond company.
Thanks, fascinating. Thanks a lot. Thanks, Rebecca.
Thank you.
Can't wait to read your book.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm checking the chat. I was wondering if there is any other question. Yes, Marcela. Please.
Yeah, sorry, I just thought of just a quick comment on the three presentations. I'm not sure if Jeffrey's back. About nationalism. Ah, yes, you're there. About nationalism and, challenging this multiculturalism or refugee policies, etc., especially at provincial levels or local levels like cities. Especially with conservative politicians there. Thank you.
Jeffrey, please.
Yeah, sorry, we lost our internet connection here. There was a power outage for a minute, and it took a while to get it reestablished. Yes, I think that multiculturalism has definitely created an atmosphere in Canada in which politicians can respond to refugees and to increase immigration in a way that other countries can't do, and allocate resources and spend money on immigrants, because generally the people feel that immigrants are helping to build the country and are needed for the economic success of the country. So there's been certainly a lot of that, and I think that's really quite a good feature of the country. We spend a lot of money on language training. People don't necessarily recognize that we're spending billions of dollars teaching people English and French. And you can go in a lot of neighborhoods in the city and see storefronts where the government offers various kinds of programs to assist immigrants in getting jobs, getting housing, and so on. So I think that is certainly a plus for multiculturalism and as social capital. I had some questions for the other two. Is there an opportunity to ask a question?
perhaps, look, Jeffrey, yes, we could hear your questions. Then we'll ask Oliver if we've got time for long answers, or if at least people can keep thinking about this and then contact you. Okay.
Okay,
What
lower
are
my
your
hand.
questions? Could we hear your questions, Jeffrey?
Oh yeah, I
please?
wanted to ask Rebecca whether there's any. I had always heard about, in connection with the diamond mines in the Northwest Territories and in about efforts to create an indigenous industry there, connected with not only the mining of diamonds, but the actual production of them for industrial use and for commercial use, which would involve skilling people, creating new schools for people trained to do the diamond cutting and those kinds of things. You didn't mention that. I don't know if that's, and the question for Camelia was about the fact that refugees, if you compare them with other immigrant categories, the skilled immigrants and family, they're the ones who encounter the most difficult problems with employment in Canada. No question about it. But I think that normally the people think the reason for that is two. One is that people come to Canada with a lot of problems stemming from their experience in the country of origin that created them, made them into refugees. They don't, they have emotional problems. They have various kinds of practical problems that they want to resolve. And so that's a problem. And the other one is that many times they're not committed to remaining in Canada permanently. So that their goal is to get back to their country of origin in many, not all, but many cases. And it seems to me those are two problems that hamper their efforts to get jobs in their country of origin. I wondered, or in their field of study, and I wonder if you have any comments from your findings about those issues.
Oliver, how long do we've got 2 minutes?
We have perhaps 2 minutes.
Okay, well, perhaps both Rebecca and Camelia could say something brief, and then Oliver, it's your turn to close up the session. Okay, Rebecca?
Yeah, thanks, Jeffrey. My sense is that the hopes for building up the industry of diamond cutting and polishing has not been abandoned by the territorial governments. They've tried a few times. They've had very short-term attempts that mostly haven't worked because of production costs. But I was reading an article just last year about how they're trying to get it up and running again. So I guess we'll see.
Gracias. Camelia?
Well, I will just answer quickly. Language is a big issue for refugees because they have not prepared their migration process. Therefore, I'm just reconfirming what you said. And then there is a big challenge because, of course, if you don't know the language, you cannot practice a profession, which is intellectual work. So that what I found was even more important than Canadian experience. That was an issue among other skilled migrants. And then about them being not committed to stay in Canada. Well, I see all of these crises that I started, they are protected crises. They will not finish soon. So even though they would maybe in an ideal world, they would like to come back to their countries, they cannot go back to their countries, not soon. So I think they are committed to stay in Canada, or maybe remigrating if Canada is not a good option. Some of them, they go to the US actually, but they cannot go back. So they are forced to stay.
Okay, well, thank you, Camelia. Yes, I think we need another session on this because there's still lots of questions and interesting points. Okay, well, Oliver.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much for your presence today. Special thanks our colleagues from Canada first, Gavin, Alexandra, Kate, Kevin, Lucy, Simone, Rebecca, of course, and Jeffrey, our colleagues from CISAN, were Claudia, Alfredo, Camelia, Graciela, our students from UNAM, Jimena, Sofía, Osvaldo, Aurora, que estuvieron aquí con nosotros, that you were with us, our teammates, Oscar and Miriam in CISAN. Thank you very much for this event today, and we will see you very soon. Fernanda, of course, thank you very much for being today, and we will see you, we hope, we will have another SPEC in May 5th. Please check in your agenda and a special edition for say from St. Mary's University, a special session, and see you soon, friends. Well, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Catherine,
Adios.
bye-bye.
Bye.